How was your visit to TCU?
My visit's been really good, particularly since it's warm here, unlike Chicago where it's cold, and I managed to slip and give myself a black eye before coming down here, so this is a nice respite from the demands of the city, and it's a joy to be here. I've been well treated, and the campus is beautiful, and the students are smart, which is a very nice combination.
What are the main points and/or themes you stressed in your lecture?
We're living in a time in which we regularly hear about and see on the televisions of massive forms of genocide and so-called crimes against humanity. The 20th century was marked as a century of violence and war. And so I think the present generation is really mindful of the force of evil in the world and are asking how to go about understanding it. For someone who works in theological ethics, as myself, the question of evil resonates both in terms of religious thought and traditions and also how we try to think ethically on these matters. There's a current debate going on among theologians and moral philosophers about the types of evil, characteristics of evil actions and intentions, and also, interestingly enough, the question of whether or not evil is thinkable or if there are forms of evil that are so heinous and so massive that they escape the very possibility of human thinking. Many post-Holocaust Jewish thinkers have made this argument with respect to the Holocaust. In other words, if we try to explain the Holocaust in rational forms, we're somewhat doing violence to the very uniqueness of that situation, a situation in which we don't really have a right to speak for the victims. But the problem with that kind of argument is that if we cannot think about and explain evil, how are we ever going to counter it? How are we ever going to struggle against it for the sake of some measure of justice and peace in our world? So the lecture was trying to pick up that problem and identify two types of evil consistent with affirming the fact that we are, one, talking about human actions. So I wasn't doing a lecture on natural evil, say hurricanes and tornadoes and earthquakes and so on. We're talking about moral evil, human action. And secondly, an argument meant to help make evil actions fully human. That is, I was trying to humanize evil so that we don't assume that evil is a consequence of some massive, amorphous, unidentifiable power working through social systems and so on and so forth. So that we can take some responsibility for our own actions in the societies we live in. I developed two notions of evil. One is what I called the wicked, which is the malicious intent and action to destroy certain levels of goods that must be met in order for human life to flourish. So wicked actions are ones that destroy the conditions for human life flourishing, given the kinds of species we are. I then identified the category of the monstrous, and this is a form of evil, what some classic thinkers, Immanuel Kant in the Enlightenment, St. Augustine in the ancient world, spoke about as radical evil. And this is a form of evil in which the agent of the evil action has chosen to make evil the very core of their own being. Milton has a line in Paradise Lost about Satan uttering, evil be thou my good. Right? That's an example of the monstrous. And I was trying to show, or my argument is that the monstrous forms of evil attack people's, individuals, and communities' moral sensibilities. It attacks conscience and attempts to obliterate that. That means that certain monstrous forms of action may not be wicked. They may not actually harm the levels of goods that we have to integrate in order to just get on in the world and flourish. It's more insidious. It could include that, but more insidiously it's trying to attack the root sense of our moral self-being and relationship to obligations and responsibilities with and for others. Hopefully, I think one of the jobs of the theological ethicist or the moral philosopher is to articulate ideas that enable people to understand more clearly what they're already living through. I don't see philosophy and theology as kind of constructing all new paradigms of thought. It's rather to try to articulate the actual structures that we're living through so we can more responsibly orient our lives within that. So hopefully those two terms I develop give folks a way to articulate the experiences or at least reflections on evil they see going on in the world.
What are the most important pieces of information you'd like people to have taken away from your lecture?
Well, as I've said before, I think one of the jobs of the moral philosopher or the theological ethicist is to provide people with concepts, ideas, sometimes even metaphoric and symbolic discourse, to help folks articulate the structures of their lived experience so that they can orient their life responsibly. This is to suggest that one of the difficulties we face in our culture is inarticulacy, that we are increasingly lacking in the ideas necessary to think through the structures we're actually living in and through. So what I hope people take away from this is three things then. One, that they have been given some concepts and ideas to think through and articulate their lived experience. That two, that is very bound up with trying to live the responsible life. And the responsible life is not just a grisly set of do's and don'ts, it's actually a way of living most deeply and humanely in the world. And third, I always try to enact in my presentation, in my writing, a particular way of actually being religious, which I call theological humanism. That is, a way of being religious that affirms the full dignity of human life, but also the ongoing moral difficulty of living a responsible life, and the joy of that as well. So I hope they take away those points, a certain set of concepts that allows them to articulate their lives with respect to a way of being religious that is committed to a humane future. We live in a world in which it's very easy to say that the religions are not working for a humane future, despite the fact that there are religious people all over the world who are doing immense good and relieving a lot of suffering. Nonetheless, I think in the States particularly, we have a picture of religion as fanatical or overly fundamentalistic. I'm trying to show a way that one can be religious and also affirm a humane future.
What are some of the practical applications of your work in this area, and why do you feel that people should be paying attention to your work?
Yeah. The job of the ethicist is not to answer every moral problem for everyone who listens to her or him. I don't understand that to be the job of the ethicist, because if it was, we would be merely taking the responsibility of how to live the moral life away from people and dictating answers to them. So the practical implications of my kind of work is in and through people who have heard or read it about how they then are given a set of tools and ideas to think about moral problems with those they live with in their communities. So it's an indirect practical application in terms of my lecturing and scholarship, in hopefully enabling people ways to understand the compass of responsibility and ways of being religious. But I think that's important to insist, the indirectness is important to insist on, otherwise the ethicist becomes a moralizer, someone wagging their finger at everyone and telling them exactly what to do. That is not what I think the task of ethics is about. So I'm hoping they'll take away from it some ideas and concepts that they then can implement in their own unique and free ways in the communities in which they live.
why do you believe that people should care about this work on evil?
Well, one of the interesting things about teaching theological ethics and moral philosophy is you don't have to struggle to get people involved. We all are living moral questions every day of our lives. What is the character of our loves? What are our obligations to our friends? How should we try to be ecologically responsible? On and on and on. So in a sense, the job of the theological ethicist is not to make ethics interesting. It's already important before we begin. The moment that someone walks into the classroom or the lecture hall, they've already been doing moral thinking and religious thinking before they come in. So why I think it's important to take what I'm doing seriously is that I try to represent a particular moral theory and way of being religious that I hope would be considered as individuals are working out and thinking through their own moral and religious lives. That is a form of hope that any scholar lives with, because we never know what's going to happen. But it's a hope that I find reaffirmed in events like my experience here at TCU and other Phi Beta Kappa lectures.
One of the things you mentioned in the 3 points was, I think you used the word, was it inarticulateness?
Yeah.
I'm really interested in that idea. What I wanted to ask is, what are the causes of that? And as you were speaking, what I was thinking of was, because of the changes in new media, people are bombarded with graphic images of evil.
Right.
And so I'm just curious about how you think that has come. How do you define that specifically, and how do you think what are the causes of it, and does the media in some way change that?
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes I say that we're a culture of chatter that cannot say anything. By that I mean we're constantly, as you noted, bombarded by images, by discourse. We're plugged online all the time, plugged in with cell phones, constantly speaking and chattering about all kinds of things. They used to have chat rooms online, right?
Right.
But they were well designated by that. But we're increasingly losing, I think, facility with a set of ideas, symbols, stories that give us the means to think more deeply about what we're living through. For myself, I think a lot of those resources actually come from the religions, since the religions are some of the oldest continual cultural forces on the planet, and they have more impact on motivating human behavior than most other cultural forms. So I always try to show how the religions can actually give us a discourse, not by saying, oh, they're revealed texts and they must be true. I want to show the actual work they can do in helping us articulate these things. The other issue that I think that leads to the inarticulacy is speed. Our culture that's so plugged in to the web and through communication means is interested in the instantaneous.
Right.
But life is not all instantaneous, and events of evil are not instantaneous. We know that what happens against young boys in the Sudan, for instance, having arms cut off, will affect generations of people. So part of the inarticulacy is not just that we're always chattering, but that it's also shrinking our memories and our ability to dwell in, at least at the level of memory and expectation, the past and a hoped-for future. How's that happening? I'm trying to say it's in a sense just part of one of the features of our digital age, the technological age. So when I say that technology, and I'm not a Luddite, I think technology is really great. It's better to be filmed here than having someone painting a picture. Right. So technology is good. I'm merely saying we have to be aware of how it's structuring our lives in order to responsibly orient ourselves in such a technological culture. Is that?
Okay.
Yep.
Would you like? I've got some more questions, but go ahead.
Well, I was I was at the lecture last night, and I was hoping that you could kind of talk through some more examples, if the differences between the monstrous and the wicked acts, or really if you could kind of talk about what makes, in your mind, what makes something unthinkable, and maybe talk through, you mentioned the Holocaust and what happened in Nazi Germany as an example of the monstrous. What parts do you see as being monstrous or unthinkable?
Yeah, by unthinkable, I mean, there was a question about this that I did answer. Mm-hmm. By unthinkable, I mean something for which you cannot give a coherent narrative of beginning to end. Mm-hmm. We can narrate the effects of monstrous actions, but it's difficult to give an account of its origins. Right? In other words, and this is something that has befuddled thinkers since St. Augustine and up to Kant and many others. How is it, under what condition does the human mind or heart or will turn against itself and will that which is not rational, not loving, not free? But that's precisely what the most evil forms of evil do. And that's what the most graphic forms of evil. And that's why I call it the monstrous. Because a moral monster is someone who is unmoored from the thick moral relations we have to each other and to ourselves, is unmoored from that, and therefore is ironically choosing not to be fully human. Right? And I used several examples. The one from the movie Seven, I think, is probably the most graphic example I've seen of late, where a man decides to execute people when they have violated one of the 7 deadly sins. He wants to show the sins that really are deadly. This means that he has severed all connections between himself and other human beings, or in terms of our moral belief systems or our culture's belief systems. In that case, the 7 deadly sins are within Christianity, so it would be within Christianity, and placing himself up above and over that tradition and other human beings. In one of my books, I did this in terms of a chapter on what I called moral madness. And that's when morality, 7 deadly sins, turns against itself to be a principle of destruction of others. So this guy was, I mean, in the movie, the plot is that he's killing people because he thinks they should die for their sins. Right? That's a moral insight. Sin is something we want to avoid, but taken to a form of madness, or the monstrous, as I put it last night.
That's Kevin Spacey, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's fabulous performance.
Kevin Spacey.
Terrifying. But
I found that a terrifying movie. Yeah. I wanted to maybe offer a follow-up to Andrew's question on the monstrous. I teach, my area is Japanese Buddhism, but I teach a course in religion and violence. And okay. I have, it actually came out of I had taught in Minnesota at a small liberal arts college, and I had a colleague who studied the Holocaust, and he and I put together a course called Religion and War Crimes, and we decided to use the notion of the monster, not the monstrous, as kind of the main. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, theoretical. I'd love to see that, yeah. Yeah, and we got that from the. Have you seen Night and Fog, the video about the Holocaust?
No,
it's a 30-minute documentary that was made, I think, in the early 1950s. But it's a really powerful film. And then it asks the narrator asks at the end of the film, who is this monster that led to this, and have we killed this monster? And obviously the answer is no. But anyway, we use that notion of the monster to look at different cases. Yeah, and. One of the cases I do is the Mumbai Attacks, and there's a good article, The Monster in the Mirror, that talks about that, and I find I've got all these other examples. But the question I wanted to ask is that a term that you had drawn from other people's work, or is that something that, this distinction of wicked and monstrous, how did that come about in your thinking?
Yeah, well, a couple of things on that. One, I use the term monstrous rather than monster because I don't want us to completely externalize.
Right.
I tried to say that the monstrous arises within an instability in our own existence.
Okay.
So there's always the possibility for the monstrous in ourselves.
Right. Right.
And the other reason I used it was as an attempt to humanize evil, that is, to give it a human face, right? Even if it's a distorted face. Now, the origin of the concept is on a couple of fronts. One is, and I quote her, although not this book, a British philosopher named Mary Midgley wrote a book on wickedness. It's quite good, actually. And then also, I mentioned Jonathan Glover's Humanity, A Moral History of the 20th Century. He uses the language of the monster as well. What I was doing, and they don't do, is try to give, in my judgment, a little more conceptual, philosophical, and historical density to the ideas, to show how one is related to the levels of goods I talked about, and how the monstrous can be understood with respect to conscience. So other thinkers have used those terms, but I'm developing them in a specific way.
Right.
I also was trying to show that we need something like the idea of the monstrous to make sense of this, of the phenomena of what people like Kant, Augustine, Paul Ricoeur, others call radical evil. Because I want to humanize it again. I want to show that radical evil is something that arises within us. It's within human beings. Just to call it radical evil, again, I worry too much externalizes the problem.
I see.
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah. So that was the reason. I'd love to see your. Is it a syllabus, a book?
Yeah, the syllabus. I'd be happy to.
I'd love to see that.
I'd be
That'd
happy
be
to
great.
share it with you.
Yeah,
I'll
be
make
great.
sure I do.
Okay,
Yeah.
that'd be good.
And I see you writing a
Yeah.
bunch of questions.
Well, I'm just sort of trying to think over it a little bit, and I'm again going back to the unthinkability. Is the argument that you're making that we make these actions out to be unthinkable because of how we think about them, essentially? Or is there something inherent in them that makes them unthinkable, and then we have to break that down or try to readdress that? Or
Right. The folks who use that language, at least as I understand them, certain post-Holocaust and other arguments, they're trying to say that it's something, that the event of evil in that case is sui generis. And of course, anything that's sui generis can't be thought, because all thinking relies upon relations of similarity and difference, right? So if you have an so in that way, it's almost like a negative miracle, because a miracle also purports to be sui generis, you know. But the human mind doesn't traffic in sui generis events. It always has to put things in terms of relation to each other and difference. So some kind of fundamental analogical structure of human knowing. I tend to agree with the analogical structure of knowing, so I want to be able to think them in some way, but not in terms of trying to get, as I said before, the very origin of when the moral self turns against itself. Like I said, they would argue that it's something in the event itself. I'm trying to get at the problem within our moral subjectivity. It may be the case that there's something in the event, but for me, we could only approach that once we have clarity on our own forms of thinking and processing matters. Yeah.
And
Dr. Hill's in the hall, by the way.
oh, is he?
Okay.
One more question.
You can go
If
and
you want.
ask and all.
Well, the question I wanted to ask then was, what do you, when you mentioned the Sudan and the Holocaust, and do you do a lot of comparison of across geography and time, and if so, what kinds of
Right.
threads and
Right. Sadly, I've not been able to do that. That's where I think the work of Glover and others who are doing sort of moral histories of the modern period are doing that kind of work. There are a number of South African folks who have addressed some of these things in their context and other contexts where you can explore this phenomena. But sad to say, I've not been able to do that kind of empirical or comparative research. It needs to be done, but I haven't been able to do that myself.
Thank you so much.
I think we got it.